The breaking of the code. The early light of dawn stretched across the ruins of Pearl Harbor, glinting on the warped steel and shattered piers that still bore the scars of the attack. Inside a dim, windowless room deep within the 14th Naval District's basement, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort bent over his cluttered desk. All around him were towers of intercepted Japanese transmissions, pages of numbers, symbols, and fragments of meaning. It was the spring of 1942. The war had turned the cryptanalyst's life into an unbroken cycle of decoding, coffee, and exhaustion. His uniform was creased, his hair unkempt, and his eyes rimmed with red. Yet his mind remained razor-sharp. Some great move by the enemy was taking shape in the noise of the radio waves. He could feel it, as if the air itself had begun to hum with warning. Beyond the basement walls, the once proud Pacific Fleet was still licking its wounds. 4 mighty battleships lay half-buried in the harbor's mud. The airstrip stood silent, littered with the remains of hundreds of aircraft. Over 2,000 Americans had died in those few devastating hours of December 7th. Japan had struck swiftly, like a blade in the dark, leaving devastation where order once stood. But Rochefort knew what the enemy could not yet see, that the United States was not broken. Their survivors were rebuilding, learning, and preparing for the moment when they would strike back with purpose and precision. A young officer stepped into the smoky room, carrying a freshly decoded sheet. "New intercept from the Japanese 4th Fleet, sir," he said, laying the paper among the chaos of messages. "They're requesting extra supplies for something called Operation MI." Rochefort looked up slowly, fatigue vanishing from his face. For weeks, fragments of Japanese communications had hinted at an immense offensive, larger even than Pearl Harbor. The same code group, AF, appeared again and again like a taunt from the other side of the ocean. If they could determine what AF represented, they might finally anticipate the next strike, and perhaps, for the first time, turn the tide of the Pacific War. Across the island, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood in his office, gazing through the glass toward the harbor where cranes and divers still labored to lift the wounded ships. He had taken command when the Pacific Fleet was at its lowest ebb, inheriting wreckage, loss, and uncertainty. Behind him, Commander Edwin Layton cleared his throat. "Sir, Rochefort's team believes they've identified a pattern in the enemy's radio traffic. They predict the major operation in early June. The scale, it could be the biggest since the war began." Nimitz turned, his expression unreadable. He was one of the few admirals who trusted intelligence work, who understood that in modern warfare, information could weigh more than steel. "How confident are they?" he asked. Layton did not hesitate. "Rochefort is certain, Admiral. He's staking his reputation on it. He believes the target lies in the Central Pacific." Down in the code room, the hours bled into one another. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the mechanical chatter of IBM tabulators. Dozens of officers worked shoulder to shoulder, sorting, comparing, calculating. "I think I found something," said Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, straightening from his station. "The Japanese keep mentioning desalination units being prepared for AF. Why would they need special water equipment unless the target was a small atoll, somewhere that lacked fresh water?" Rochefort's thoughts began to race. A remote island, vital to the defense of Hawaii, small enough to require shipped water. It all pointed to a single location: Midway.
Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes proposed an idea so bold it seemed almost theatrical. Let's have Midway send an uncoded message saying their water plant is down. If the Japanese mention water shortages for AF in their next transmission, we'll know for sure. Rochefort agreed. The trap was set. Within days, the confirmation came through. The enemy referred to AF's water problem. The mystery was solved. The Japanese were coming for Midway. And as Rochefort's team silently celebrated in that windowless basement, the balance of the Pacific War had already begun to shift. Prelude to Midway. "Patch me through to Commander Layton," Rochefort said sharply, breaking the tense silence of the basement office. "Tell Midway to send a plain text emergency signal. Say their water distillation plant has failed." The instruction was simple, but the stakes behind it were immense. If the Japanese mentioned this fake crisis in their coded traffic, they would finally confirm what Rochefort already suspected. AF was Midway. Far out at sea, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay confined to the sickbay, his skin inflamed by a severe attack of dermatitis that left him too weak to even stand. It was a bitter blow. The fierce, impulsive commander who had spearheaded the Navy's early carrier raids was now sidelined on the eve of what might become the most decisive battle of the Pacific. When Admiral Raymond Spruance entered his quarters, the contrast between the two men was stark. Halsey, all fire and instinct; Spruance, calm and deliberate, the kind who measured each decision like a chess player studying the board. "You look terrible, Bill," Spruance said softly, trying to hide his concern. Halsey managed a tired grin. "Ray, I'm turning the task force over to you. Take my ships, take my boys, and hit 'em hard. They trust you, and so do I." Spruance accepted the order with a firm nod. Though he had never commanded carriers in combat, his grasp of naval tactics was unmatched, and he carried a quiet confidence that inspired those around him. In the days to come, his composure and clear judgment would be tested like never before. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 miles away on the tiny atoll of Midway, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon surveyed his small and uneven air group. The airfield was crowded with a patchwork of aircraft, aging Brewster Buffalo fighters, a few newer Wildcats, and several bomber types, none truly ideal for what was coming. His pilots were young, many fresh from training, their courage still untested. Major Lofton Henderson, eyeing the stubby buffaloes lined along the runway, couldn't hold back his frustration. "Colonel, do they really expect us to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" he asked, half in disbelief. The buffaloes had earned the grim nickname "Flying Coffins" among their crews. Shannon's expression hardened. "We'll stop them or die trying. Every minute we can delay them buys time for the fleet. That's our mission, to hold no matter the cost." Back at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort's team received the confirmation they had been waiting for. Japanese intelligence traffic now mentioned water shortages at AF. The trap had worked. AF was Midway. The realization sent a charge of energy through the command center. Rochefort immediately relayed the intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who wasted no time summoning his senior officers.
"Gentlemen," Nimitz began, his tone measured but resolute, "we now know the enemy's target and roughly when they intend to strike. They plan to attack Midway in early June with at least 4 carriers. This is our opportunity to catch them by surprise." Captain Miles Browning, formerly Halsey's chief of staff and now serving under Spruance, studied the decoded reports. "Sir," he said cautiously, "our reconnaissance indicates Japan could field as many as 6 carriers. If they bring their entire force—" "They won't," Nimitz interrupted, his voice calm and certain. "Signals show they've divided their fleet. 2 carriers are heading north toward the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3 of our own." Even with that reassurance, the odds were daunting. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were veterans of both Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean campaigns. Their air crews were elite, tempered by years of combat. The American task force, by contrast, was courageous but inexperienced. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown would have to stand against the most powerful naval air arm in the world. There was another problem. Yorktown had been badly damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. She limped back to Pearl Harbor with gaping holes in her flight deck and ruptured fuel lines.
When Nimitz asked his repair chief for an estimate, the answer was grim. 3 months at least, Admiral. She's taken deep structural hits. Nimitz didn't blink. You have 3 days, he said flatly. I want that ship patched, fueled, and sailing with the others, whatever it takes. And so, as welders worked around the clock and mechanics fought exhaustion, an entire fleet prepared for the confrontation that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The stage was set for Midway. Forging the fleet. The repair officer's face betrayed his shock, but when he looked into Admiral Nimitz's steady gaze, he heard the unspoken order and answered without hesitation. Yes, Admiral. We'll keep men on the job around the clock. As May slipped away, Pearl Harbor transformed into a frantic workshop. Around Yorktown, a roughly 1,400-man workforce moved like a single machine, welding plates, riveting seams, replacing burned systems, compressing what normally demanded months of dockyard labor into a relentless 3-day marathon. Crews pushed beyond human limits. Men fell asleep where they stood and rose again to keep grinding. Each shored hull, each patched fuel line, every bolted piece of deck was treated as if it might be the thin margin separating survival from catastrophe.
On the partially restored carrier, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch assembled his fighter pilots for a briefing. Thatch had been refining tactics specifically to blunt the Zero's dominance, Japan's nimble fighter that had been turning dogfights in its favor. He spoke plainly and with urgency. The Zero could outmaneuver and outclimb them. It was light and fast. But American Wildcats were rugged machines that could absorb punishment. Thatch introduced a cooperative maneuver, later known as the Thatch Weave, designed for pairs of fighters to cover one another and to deny an enemy the single-ship turn-and-burn advantage. Pair up, watch each other's tails, and don't chase a Zero alone, he told them. The formation was an answer born of necessity and hard experience. Among those listening was Ensign George Gay, a young pilot from Texas recently out of flight school with only a few hundred hours in the air. He tried to tamp down his nerves as Thatch outlined the grim realities. Torpedo squadrons would have to run low and slow into dense flak and enemy fighters, missions that many called suicidal. No one spoke of fear aloud, but the silence carried its weight. Each aviator knew that sacrifice might be the currency of any chance they had to blunt the Japanese advance. In Pearl Harbor's intelligence rooms, analysts continued to assemble a fuller picture of Japan's intended order of battle. They confirmed what many in Washington already feared. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the strategist behind the Pearl Harbor attack, was personally directing the forthcoming operation. Command of the striking force lay with Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same officer who had executed the surprise raid months earlier. The intercepted signals suggested enormous confidence on the enemy's part. They seemed determined to finish the campaign they'd opened 6 months before. "They're bringing everything," one planning officer reported. Battleships, cruisers, transports, and invasion forces poised to seize Midway and convert it into a staging base for further operations toward Hawaii. Nimitz's response was steady and clear. "Let them come," he said. His reasoning was simple. A larger enemy commitment increased what Japan stood to lose. If American forces could meet that weight and strike where it mattered, the outcome might tilt decisively. With that resolve, the Pacific Command set its plans in motion. On May 28th, Task Force 16, built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet and under Spruance's leadership, slipped quietly out of Pearl Harbor. Cruisers and destroyers formed protective screens as sailors took stations. 2 days later, on May 30th, the freshly repaired Yorktown steamed away, still sporting the patchwork of hurried workmen. The 3 carriers were due to link up northeast of Midway at a rendezvous known informally as Point Luck, a position chosen to place them in an ambush posture against the approaching Japanese task force. Aboard Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance reviewed the latest decrypts and reconnaissance reports with his staff.
Unlike the impulsive, aggressive commanders who operated by instinct, Spruance was measured, an analyst at heart, who weighed scenarios and probabilities before committing forces. He emphasized the strategic advantage held by American planners. The Japanese believed they would achieve surprise, convinced that U.S. carriers were absent or still to the south. "Their assumption is our edge," Spruance told his officers. "We must turn their overconfidence into a trap."
Commander Wade McCluskey, who would lead Enterprise's air arm, prepared his squadron leaders with a clear operational plan. He knew the limits of their machines and the temper of his men. The assault doctrine was straightforward. Dive bombers strike from above at steep angles. Torpedo squadrons run low to batter carrier flight decks, and fighters provide protection where possible, but cover would be limited. Speed, secrecy, and accurate bombing were the keys. "When we find their carriers," McCluskey briefed, "we hit them all out. We ignore cruiser and battleship targets. Those are secondary. Carriers are the prize." One of McCluskey's top dive bomber pilots, Lieutenant Richard or Dick Best, was singled out for a more tactical briefing. Best had earned a reputation for precision in dive bombing, skill that the fleet would soon rely upon in the vital moments ahead. "Don't be tempted by other ships," Best warned his crews. "Our mission is to sink the carriers. Do that, and the rest will follow." With carriers on the move, crews welded, aviators drilled new formations, and commanders synchronized plans down to the last radio channel. The stage was set. Men, machines, and strategy converged on a single pivotal objective: hold Midway at any cost and seize the initiative in the Pacific. The gathering storm at Midway. As May gave way to June 1942, two vast naval forces began to move toward an encounter that would reshape the balance of the Pacific. The Americans, armed with priceless intelligence from their newly successful code-breaking efforts, had placed their carriers in position to strike first. Yet intelligence alone could not win what lay ahead. The coming battle would hinge on the reflexes of young pilots, the calm or panic of commanders making split-second choices, and the razor-thin margins that defined modern carrier warfare. On the tiny atoll of Midway, final preparations reached their peak. Mechanics armed every serviceable aircraft and filled their tanks to the brim. Marines reinforced foxholes and gun positions carved into the coral. Inside dim radar huts, operators kept their scopes glowing, aware that a faint signal on their screens might be the first warning before the sky erupted. Everyone on the island understood their purpose: hold long enough for the fleet to strike. Commander Cyril Simard, Midway's senior officer, walked the sandy airstrips one last time before nightfall. He inspected rows of bombers, fighters, and fuel drums stacked dangerously close together. The atoll's two small islands, Sand and Eastern, were crowded with munitions and aviation fuel. A single direct hit could ignite a chain reaction capable of obliterating the entire base. But evacuation or dispersal was impossible. Midway would either stand or burn, and its survival would determine whether the Pacific would belong to Japan or the United States.
When darkness settled over the ocean on June 3rd, American PBY Catalina patrol planes fanned out in broad arcs from the atoll. These ungainly, slow-moving aircraft were the Navy's eyes over thousands of miles of open sea. Their crews knew the grim reality. If they found the Japanese fleet, they might not live to report it. But discovery was their duty, and they flew on. At 9 a.m. that morning, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a Catalina, sighted dark silhouettes on the horizon. Enemy main body spotted, he radioed back to Midway, bearing 262, distance 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been located, transport ships, escorts, and warships steaming east. Yet their aircraft carriers, the real threat, were still nowhere to be seen. Later that afternoon, 9 American B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from Midway and bombed the convoy, but the high-altitude attack achieved no hits. That night, 4 PBYs armed with torpedoes launched a daring strike under cover of darkness, claiming a single possible hit. The damage was minimal, but the effect was significant. The Japanese now knew that the Americans were alert and waiting. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, alarms sounded aboard the American carriers. In their ready rooms, pilots attended final briefings, quietly writing last notes to loved ones before climbing into their flight suits. Deck crews performed last-minute checks, fueling and arming aircraft under red battle lights. Bombs were hoisted, torpedoes latched into racks, and engines primed for launch. Across 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the still-scarred Yorktown, barely 230 planes would soon take on the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, directing the operation from Yorktown, made a bold strategic decision that would define the American approach. The carriers would not sail in one concentrated group. Instead, he ordered them to operate separately, limiting the chance that all 3 could be caught and destroyed in the single blow. It was a calculated risk, but the entire enterprise rested on risk. The Americans had no numerical superiority. What they had was knowledge of the enemy's plan and the will to act first. As the first light of June 4th began to tint the horizon, both fleets were unknowingly poised for one of history's most decisive engagements. The Japanese advanced with supreme confidence, certain they would surprise a scattered and weakened foe. But instead of victims, they were steaming straight into an ambush crafted by intelligence, determination, and audacious planning. The U.S. Navy, battered but unbroken after Pearl Harbor, was about to prove that courage and calculation could overturn even the greatest imbalance of power. At 4:30 a.m., the quiet skies over Midway erupted with the thunder of engines. From the decks of 4 Japanese carriers, Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 aircraft toward the island. 36 torpedo bombers fitted with general-purpose bombs, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort. The formation stretched for miles, illuminated faintly by the first rays of dawn. Not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lay hidden just beyond the horizon, waiting for their moment to strike.
At 5:52 a.m., Midway's radar operators picked up a cluster of contacts sweeping in from the northwest. Many planes, bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles. One operator reported calmly into his microphone, though his pulse raced. Within seconds, sirens screamed across the atoll. Marines sprinted to their guns, pilots ran for their aircraft, and ground crews scrambled to push every flyable machine into the air. Those that failed to launch would be destroyed where they sat. The defenders of Midway braced themselves as the first great battle of the Pacific carrier age truly began. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the gray morning, flying an aircraft lineup that included the outdated Brewster Buffaloes. Everyone aboard understood the grim arithmetic. The Buffalo was slower, less agile, and undergunned compared with the nimble Japanese Zero. Still, Henderson's pilots climbed into the sky with grim resolve. Their orders were to defend Midway at all costs. Radio reports crackled through the headsets, enemy fighters at 1,200 feet and closing. When the first squadrons met the Japanese interceptors, the engagement quickly turned deadly. Zeros dove like predators, ripping through formations. American fighters caught fire and began to fall in smoking spirals toward the sea. Henderson himself went down while pressing his attack. Their losses were catastrophic.
Yet the Marines' desperate sortie did achieve a crucial aim. It broke the enemy's attack formation long enough to allow many Midway aircraft to get airborne and to give reconnaissance planes time to report the Japanese dispositions. By the time Tomonaga's strike elements reached the atoll, the assault hit with brutal force. Bombs smashed into runways, fuel stores, and emplacements. Black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts peppered the sky. One blast severed the island's power and put the primary radar out of service. Another ignited fuel reserves, belching thick smoke that blackened the dawn. Still, when the carrier strike leader circled back to assess results, he found the airfield scarred but not eliminated. Craters could be filled and defenses repaired, and most dangerously for the attackers, many of Midway's planes had already flown. Tomonaga reported back that a follow-up wave was required, an order that set in motion a chain of wrenching choices on the Japanese carriers. Admiral Nagumo faced a perilous tactical crossroads aboard Akagi. Hundreds of serviceable aircraft were waiting, but they were armed for anti-ship action, torpedoes and armor-piercing loads, because Nagumo had kept a strike force ready if American ships appeared. Re-equipping planes for another assault on land targets meant stripping torpedoes and reattaching general-purpose bombs across crowded hangars, with ordnance crews moving heavy munitions amid fuel and fumes. At 0715, he committed to the rearmament, and decks transformed into frantic, hazardous workshops as sailors and airmen raced against time to change bombs and readjust loadouts. Unbeknownst to Nagumo, American carriers nearby were already launching their counterstrikes. Admiral Spruance, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet Group, had ordered every available plane airborne at maximum range, accepting the risk that many pilots might lack margin for a safe return. Across the U.S. decks, orders echoed and crews surged. Engines fired, flight crews strapped in, and warplanes rolled toward the horizon. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, briefing his men with blunt honesty about the slim odds facing their slow Douglas TBD devastators. "If we run out of gas, we'll ditch together," he told them. "If only one gets through, he must strike a carrier." Among Waldron's pilots was Ensign George Gay. His rear gunner, Seaman Bob Huntington, tried to hide his fear with a thumbs up before the squadron took off.
By 0800, the American attack groups were airborne, but became separated by clouds and distance, each element pushing independently toward the projected Japanese location, a lack of cohesion that would be both a hindrance and an unexpected advantage. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, a reconnaissance aircraft reported surface contacts to Nagumo at 0728, but failed to identify ship types, leaving the admiral unsure whether carriers were present. He ordered rearming to stop. Hangars and decks froze in confusion. Some planes were already reconfigured for land strikes, others only partly changed, and loose ordnance cluttered the workspaces. The delay proved calamitous. At 0820, another scout returned with the confirmation that chilled Nagumo. American carriers were indeed at sea nearby. His striking force hung between differing arming states, while the enemy he most feared was already launching into the sky. The turning tide at Midway. As Admiral Nagumo wrestled with his options, a new crisis emerged. His first strike group was returning from Midway, nearly out of fuel and demanding immediate recovery. The skies above the Japanese task force soon filled with incoming aircraft from the island. Marine dive bombers and Army B-17s arriving in waves, striking from different altitudes but without coordination. Their courage was undeniable, but their attacks were futile. The Japanese carriers, nimble and disciplined, slipped away from every falling bomb. Zeros tore through the Marine squadrons with ruthless precision. Yet every failed assault forced Nagumo's flight crews to halt or redirect operations, gradually throwing his schedule into disorder. By 9:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron finally glimpsed the Japanese fleet through a gap in the clouds.
His Torpedo Squadron 8 was flying alone, isolated after losing contact with their escorting fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew the situation was hopeless. His slow Douglas TBD Devastators would be easy prey without cover, but retreat was never an option. "We attack now," he commanded. The 15 torpedo bombers descended to wave-top height, advancing toward the enemy line like men rowing into a storm. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, Elite Zero fighters, pounced immediately. In seconds, the sky turned into a slaughterhouse. One after another, the American torpedo planes burst into flames, their trails of smoke streaking across the ocean. Waldron's own aircraft was ripped apart mid-dive, cartwheeling into the sea. Only Ensign George Gay, a young pilot from Texas, remained airborne long enough to witness the destruction of his comrades. His rear gunner, Bob Huntington, fired until a burst of cannon fire killed him instantly. Gay dropped his torpedo toward the carrier Tsuruyu, then skimmed directly over her deck so low he could see the astonished faces of Japanese sailors below. Moments later, his Devastator was shredded by gunfire and crashed into the Pacific. Miraculously, Gay survived, wounded and alone, hiding beneath a seat cushion as flames and debris spread across the water. Of the 30 men in Torpedo Squadron 8, he was the only one to live. Their torpedoes, many of which malfunctioned or failed to detonate, inflicted no damage. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. By drawing the Japanese fighters downward to sea level, Waldron's men had unknowingly cleared the upper altitudes for the next wave. Moments later, new American torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived, only to meet the same fate. Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 10 of 12. The outdated Devastators and their unreliable weapons seemed to confirm Japanese superiority beyond doubt. But those relentless, doomed attacks forced Nagumo's carriers into constant evasive maneuvers, halting takeoffs and landings, and plunging his decks into chaos. By 10:20, the Japanese formation was a picture of confusion. Planes running out of fuel circled overhead. Others were being hastily refueled and rearmed below decks, and bombs and torpedoes lay scattered amid volatile aviation fuel. Fire precautions were ignored in the frantic rush to launch another strike against the American carriers.
It was at that very moment, as the Japanese fleet reached the height of its vulnerability, that Commander Wade McCluskey appeared high above with 33 dive bombers from USS Enterprise. He and his pilots had been searching for hours, flying dangerously low on fuel. Just as McCluskey considered turning back, he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Trusting his instincts, he followed its wake, and it led him straight to Nagumo's carriers. At 10:22 a.m., through broken clouds, the targets came into view. Below him lay 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, their decks crowded with aircraft and loaded ordnance. Not a single Zero challenged McCluskey's approach. All were still engaged at low altitude. He split his force and issued the command Americans had been waiting to hear since Pearl Harbor: attack. Lieutenant Richard Best dove toward the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Through flak and smoke, he aimed at the growing shape of the carrier below. At 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb, pulling out sharply as his wingmen followed in sequence. Most bombs missed, but Best's did not. It pierced Akagi's flight deck and exploded deep within the hangar among fuel lines and armed planes. The ship erupted in a chain of detonations that ripped through her core. Fire rolled across the deck, turning the carrier into a burning citadel within minutes. At the same time, McCluskey's other squadron struck Kaga, scoring multiple direct hits that triggered uncontrollable fires. From the Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers attacked Soryu, landing 3 devastating blows in perfect formation.
In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's elite carriers were engulfed in flames, their decks exploding in violent succession. From his hiding place in the ocean, George Gay watched the unthinkable unfold. The mighty Japanese fleet, so feared and seemingly invincible only hours earlier, was now a floating graveyard. Sailors abandoned ship, leaping into the burning, oil-slicked water as the fires devoured their vessels. The remains of Gay's fallen squadron drifted beside him, silent witnesses to the turning of history. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the blazing Akagi to a cruiser, was stunned. In less than 10 minutes, 3/4 of his carrier force, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had been destroyed. Only Hiryu remained operational, fleeing northwest to regroup and prepare a desperate counterstrike. That afternoon, Hiryu's bombers located Yorktown. Despite fierce defense from American fighters and anti-aircraft guns, they scored 3 direct hits that left the carrier burning and listing heavily. Damage control crews fought the fires heroically, managing to stabilize the ship, until a second wave of torpedo bombers arrived. 2 torpedoes slammed into her hull, sealing her fate. Admiral Fletcher transferred his command to a nearby cruiser, while Admiral Spruance assumed tactical control. Yorktown's crew abandoned their ship, though the carrier refused to die, remaining afloat until June 7th, when the Japanese submarine I-168 delivered the final blow. The loss of Yorktown was a bitter wound, but the battle's outcome was already decided. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise found and destroyed Hiryu, setting her ablaze from bow to stern. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor lay on the bottom of the Pacific. The Empire's aura of invincibility had vanished, and the course of the war had changed forever.
The night after Midway. As night descended over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the surviving American pilots made their way back to their carriers, running on little more than fumes. Many would never return. Some aircraft, crippled from battle or drained of fuel, were forced to ditch in the dark waters below. Naval destroyers churned through the waves, their searchlights sweeping the Black Sea in desperate rescue operations. The cost in lives and machines had been steep, but the strategic reward was beyond measure. Admiral Raymond Spruance, known for his restraint and composure, chose not to chase the retreating Japanese fleet into the night. Somewhere in the darkness, Yamamoto's battleships waited, their massive guns capable of annihilating his exhausted carrier force. Rather than gamble his victory on a nighttime encounter, Spruance held his line. Some criticized his caution at the time, but history would vindicate his judgment. When dawn broke on June 5th, American reconnaissance planes scouted the horizon and found only smoking ruins, carriers still burning, oil slicks stretching for miles, and scattered survivors clinging to debris. A few Japanese aircraft, hastily launched from damaged ships and nearby cruisers, made last futile strikes that achieved nothing. Over the following 2 days, U.S. forces maintained pressure on the retreating enemy, striking again and again. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was sent to the bottom, and several other Japanese ships suffered severe damage. The numbers told a grim story. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,500 men, including some of their most experienced naval aviators. The Americans paid a price as well: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 362 men. Yet these figures alone could not convey the magnitude of what had occurred. Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was the moment Japan's expansion across the Pacific came to a halt. The initiative, once firmly in Tokyo's hands, had shifted irreversibly to the United States. Lessons and reckoning. In the days that followed, both nations tried to make sense of what had happened. For the Americans, the triumph was the result of faith in intelligence, calculated risk, and individual courage. Admiral Nimitz's decision to trust his cryptographers had placed his carriers precisely where they needed to be. Spruance's discipline in battle and the audacity of pilots who attacked against impossible odds combined to achieve what had seemed unthinkable only months before. For Japan, the defeat exposed deep cracks in their war machine. The overconfidence that had fueled their early victories now proved their undoing. Their operational plan had been far too elaborate, dividing their forces and leaving their carriers exposed. Critical reconnaissance failures meant they never located the American carriers until it was too late. And above all, those fatal moments spent rearming and refueling aircraft created a window of vulnerability that American dive bombers exploited to devastating effect. But perhaps the most profound lesson of Midway lay in the sacrifice of men like John Waldron and his Torpedo Squadron 8. Their low-level attack had ended in complete destruction, but it was their courage, drawing enemy fighters to sea level, that made victory possible. Every man in that squadron had known what awaited them, yet they went anyway. Their doomed charge became the hinge upon which the battle turned. When news of the victory reached home, the mood across the United States transformed. After 6 months of relentless setbacks following Pearl Harbor, the American public finally had reason to hope. For the first time, it felt as though the tide of war could indeed be turned.
The collapse of an empire. In Japan, the reaction was the opposite. The government concealed the extent of the disaster from its citizens. Sailors returning from Midway were placed under strict isolation to prevent rumors from spreading. Official propaganda claimed success, but within the Navy, the truth was undeniable. The Japanese offensive, an unbroken streak since December 1941, was over. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war, desperately trying to hold on to its vast empire against an enemy growing stronger every day. The Battle of Midway became more than a military engagement. It was a pivot in world history. It revealed the decisive power of intelligence and timing, proving that foresight could overcome numerical inferiority. It demonstrated that valor, even when it appeared futile, could alter the course of battle. And it showed that the United States possessed not just industrial might, but the will to fight and win. A new era of warfare. In his after-action report, Admiral Nimitz distributed praise with precision. He credited the codebreakers who had deciphered Japan's intentions, the commanders who made split-second decisions under immense pressure, and the pilots whose bravery had changed the course of the war. But he also acknowledged the element of chance. Had the American dive bombers arrived just 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had launched their own counterstrike, the outcome might have been reversed. Japan's loss of 4 fleet carriers represented not just the destruction of ships, but the loss of years of training, experience, and tactical doctrine. Although new carriers would eventually join their fleet, the combination of skilled air crews and operational confidence that had defined their early victories could never be rebuilt. For the young American aviators who survived, Midway remained a defining moment in their lives. Lieutenant Dick Best, whose bomb doomed the carrier Akagi, continued to fly missions, but would never again experience the same intensity as those brief, world-changing minutes. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Waldron's squadron, carried the memories of his fallen comrades for the rest of his life. Midway also marked the dawn of a new military era. Never before had a major naval engagement been fought entirely by aircraft, where the opposing fleets never even saw one another. The battleship age that had defined maritime warfare for centuries
was finished. The aircraft carrier now reigned supreme. In a broader sense, Midway was America's Stalingrad, the moment when an unstoppable enemy advance was not merely checked, but reversed. From that day forward, the Pacific War would belong to the United States, and the long road to Tokyo had begun. The long retreat begins, Midway, and its legacy. The aftermath of Midway marked the first crack in the armor of Imperial Japan. What followed, the brutal, unrelenting campaign on Guadalcanal, would turn that crack into a widening fracture. Together, these battles signaled the beginning of Japan's slow retreat across the vast Pacific. From that moment onward, the tide of war was no longer in Japan's favor.
The United States, with its industrial power now fully harnessed for war, began producing ships, aircraft, and munitions at a pace no nation could rival. For every carrier Japan lost, America built several more. Steel, oil, and manpower flowed from the homeland in endless quantities. The sailors and pilots who had survived Midway soon found themselves fighting again, in the Solomons, in the skies above the Philippines, and eventually within sight of Japan's own shores. They carried with them a new confidence, the understanding that the Japanese Navy, once feared as invincible, could be beaten. For Japan, the lesson was far harsher. Midway had torn the veil from a dangerous illusion, that spiritual fervor and warrior discipline could compensate for overwhelming material inferiority. The Japanese command had launched a war against an opponent whose factories, shipyards, and refineries outnumbered their own tenfold. At Midway, that imbalance became undeniable. The Americans had not only superior resources, but also the intelligence and courage to wield them with precision. Much of that success was owed to the quiet, unseen work of codebreakers stationed in cramped, smoke-filled rooms thousands of miles from the battle. Men like Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptographic team cracked the Japanese naval codes, identifying AF as the target, Midway itself. With this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz could place his limited forces exactly where they were needed. It was a triumph of intellect over secrecy, yet few of those men were publicly honored. Their contributions remained buried under wartime secrecy for decades. Rochefort himself was reassigned soon after the battle, caught in the crossfire of bureaucratic rivalries in Washington. Only in 1986, long after his death, would the U.S. Navy posthumously award him the Distinguished Service Medal he had long deserved. As the decades passed, the Battle of Midway took on an almost legendary status in military history. It became a case study taught in academies around the world, a lesson in how intelligence, tactical audacity, and sheer bravery can overturn impossible odds. Scholars dissected Nimitz's decisions, Spruance's restraint, and the near-miraculous timing that brought American dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at precisely the right moment. But behind those analytical studies lay a more human story, one of sacrifice, endurance, and courage beyond calculation. Marine pilots flew outdated fighters against the deadly Zeros. Torpedo squadrons launched hopeless attacks without fighter escort, their planes torn apart by enemy guns before they could release their payloads. Yet those doomed assaults forced Japanese defenses out of position, clearing the skies for the dive bombers that would strike the decisive blows. Below deck, damage control teams fought fires, sealed flooded compartments, and kept their burning ships afloat. Every man who fought that day played a part in turning the course of the Pacific War. The victory at Midway was more than a military triumph. It was proof that a democracy could summon the discipline and resolve to defeat a militarized empire. Many of the sailors aboard American carriers had been civilians only months before. Factory workers, farmers, and students who now faced an enemy trained from birth for war. Yet when tested, these ordinary men matched their adversaries in skill and surpassed them in courage. Midway's lessons reached far beyond 1942.
It revealed that weakness, when paired with ingenuity and persistence, could become a source of unexpected strength. It showed that courage often blooms in the shadow of fear, and that even failed efforts, like the doomed torpedo runs, can lay the groundwork for victory. It reminded the world that technological power alone is useless without the will to act decisively.
When the sun set on June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean had changed forever. Japan's advance had been stopped and its fate sealed. Though its soldiers and sailors would continue to fight fiercely for 3 more years, the strategic outcome was no longer in question. A smaller, outnumbered American force had shattered the heart of Japan's naval might and seized the initiative for good. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early triumphs, had once warned his superiors that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that, he held no faith in victory. His grim forecast came true almost to the day. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. In the smoldering wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers, his prophecy was fulfilled. Midway's significance extended beyond the immediate tactical success. It proved that warfare had entered a new age, one where intelligence networks, code breaking, and coordinated air power would decide battles more than brute force or battleship broadsides. The seamless cooperation between cryptanalysts, strategists, and frontline pilots at Midway set the pattern for the modern era of warfare. From that turning point onward, Japan was on the defensive, retreating island by island toward its homeland. For America, Midway was the moment it realized not only that it could win, but that it would. Midway, the human face of victory. For the men who fought in the Battle of Midway, the events of June 1942 were far more than a clash of fleets. They were a test of endurance, courage, and the quiet strength of ordinary individuals thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Many of the sailors and airmen were barely out of their teens, yet in the chaos of battle, they showed a steadiness that belied their youth. On the flight decks, mechanics worked with trembling hands and sleepless eyes, coaxing battered aircraft back into the sky. Deep below, engineers and repair crews fought fires and flooding, refusing to abandon ships that seemed beyond saving. Radio operators, faces lit by the glow of their consoles, kept the fragile lifeline of communication open even as enemy bombs thundered around them. Every man's effort, however small it might have seemed in the moment, became a vital thread in the fabric of victory. Their Japanese counterparts displayed no less bravery. Pilots launched into impossible odds, knowing their carriers were ablaze and their mission hopeless. Sailors refused to leave their posts even as decks burned and ammunition exploded beneath their feet. Many chose death over surrender, a reflection of a warrior code that valued honor above life itself. They too fought for their homeland, for their comrades, and for an ideal that felt larger than themselves.
In the months and years that followed, both navies took hard lessons from Midway. For the United States, it was a revelation. Carrier operations were refined, torpedoes redesigned, and pilot training intensified. New ships and aircraft rolled off American assembly lines in numbers the enemy could scarcely comprehend. Japan, meanwhile, faced a painful reality. The heart of its carrier force had been gutted, and the elite pilots who had once guaranteed its dominance were gone. Though they rebuilt, the momentum had shifted irreversibly.
America's vast industrial engine, now fully mobilized, would soon flood the Pacific with steel, oil, and men. From that point on, Japan's war was a fight for survival. The Battle of Midway endures as one of the most decisive encounters in naval history. In just a few pivotal minutes on June 4th, the course of the Pacific War was transformed. American dive bombers arrived at precisely the moment when Japanese carriers were most exposed, their decks crowded with refueling aircraft and live ordnance. The resulting inferno crippled Japan's ability to carry the offensive. From those burning ships, a new chapter of the war began, one in which the United States would move from defense to dominance, advancing island by island toward Tokyo. Today, Midway Atoll lies silent. Its runways are cracked and overgrown, its hangars empty, its control towers ghosts of another age. Yet the waters surrounding it remain sacred. Beneath the waves rest the remains of men from both nations, bound forever by the battle that reshaped the world. Their courage reminds us that freedom is not self-sustaining. It demands vigilance, discipline, and sacrifice. Midway stands as evidence that intelligence and preparation can triumph over superior numbers, and that ordinary people, when united by purpose, can accomplish the extraordinary. The battle also marked a transformation in how wars would be fought. No longer would fleets depend solely on the thunder of battleship guns. At Midway, aircraft had become the new kings of the sea. Intelligence and timing proved as decisive as armor and firepower. The United States Navy carried those lessons forward, embedding them into its doctrine of carrier warfare and its reliance on information superiority, principles that still guide naval operations in the 21st century. From the admirals who commanded the fleets to the lone survivors floating amidst the wreckage, every participant shaped the outcome. Admiral Chester Nimitz, directing operations from Pearl Harbor, trusted his intelligence officers and made bold decisions under immense pressure. On the opposite end of the spectrum, men like Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, bore witness to the sacrifice of comrades whose courage paved the way for victory. Their collective determination turned what might have been a crushing defeat into a defining triumph, one that would alter the direction of the war and the history of the modern world. Ultimately, Midway was more than a military success. It was a moral and strategic watershed. It represented the triumph of intellect over arrogance, discipline over chaos, and resolve over fear. It demonstrated that democracies, though often slow to awaken, could wield immense strength once stirred. In those critical days, America proved that its ideals, liberty, justice, and the defense of the free world could withstand the fury of tyranny. More than 80 decades later, the echoes of Midway still resonate. The lesson born from that tiny atoll remains timeless. That courage, preparation, and unity can alter the course of history, even when the odds seem impossible.